Most people dismiss election season as a media circus, but the upcoming 2020 campaign could have serious repercussions. That's according to author, educator, and foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine, Alex Newman. Mr. Newman, whose groundbreaking work can also be found at thenewamerican.com, discusses the very real risk that if the equities market crashes during Trump's presidency, America could end up electing someone who will jeopardize our constitutional freedoms. If you look at the stock market right now, you'll notice that we're headed towards record-breaking heights, but on no fresh catalysts. If the worst-case scenario plays out, you'll want to follow the critical steps to survival we outline at crushthestreet.com/Trump. This is an incredibly volatile period where literally anything can happen. So protect yourself and your family by going to crushthestreet.com/Trump. So without further ado, here's Alex Newman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I'm Kenneth Amaduri, and I'm joined today with a returning guest, Alex Newman of the newamerican.com. A solid journalist and someone who's been on the show before, very articulate, fact-based, and someone in the know, very well connected. And we're going to be discussing, kind of where we left off last time. The last time we spoke, we were speaking after the midterm elections. There was supposed to be this massive blue wave that really never took place, more fake news. Now we have the Russia situation, Trump collusion, the Mueller report, a complete non-event. One of the biggest conspiracy theories now that went on for a couple of years, completely debunked. And Trump pretty much vindicated in this whole situation. And I just want to start here and get Alex's thoughts on where things are going, where we are as a country, and maybe what we can expect down the line here. And I want to actually get into something that he's been working on and doing a lot of research on himself, which is the climate change and what's going on with the Trump administration. So without any further ado, Alex Newman, thanks for coming on the show with me today.
Thank you very much for having me on, Kenneth. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, let's start off with the Russia conspiracy debunked Mueller story. Where does this leave us as a country? Divided, more divided than ever? What does it say about the left and left versus right? Some thoughts there.
Well, I think the real story here, Kenneth, and this is what's being completely missed by most of the media, is that the deep state uses these sorts of tricks to take down people they don't like. They tried it on President Trump, and it doesn't seem to have worked, which is, I think, phenomenal news. And we called it out from the beginning that this conspiracy theory was, and there's some conspiracy theories that have truth to them, but this is not one of those. And we called that from the beginning. I mean, it was so ludicrous. It's hard to believe anybody believed that, but I think it was a lot of wishful thinking. But I think it gives us a big leg up now in trying to expose some of the very real problems that are taking place. We've been speaking about the deep state for many years. We did a special report in early 2018 where we really honed in on this idea of a deep state trying to overthrow the democratically elected president of the United States. And it wasn't a new phenomenon. What was new is that typically its own agents have been in the White House. And so what was new was this situation where somebody who not only wasn't part of the deep state, but was actively hostile to it and its key agendas. Trump was on the campaign trail saying we're going to reject globalism. Americanism will be our credo. We're not going to sell out to international bankers anymore who want to create a world government. We're not going to do these multilateral trade deals that infringe on our sovereignty. So what was really new was that an active enemy of this deep state was in power. And as we expected, they threw everything that they could at him, and now they have been defeated. And so now I think is when the fun starts, the real fun starts, because you have the president talking about, he's used the word treason repeatedly. I think treason is the correct word to use, not just because they were persecuting him using kooky conspiracy theories, but because they've been trying to overthrow our constitutional system of government. As Trump pointed out on the campaign trail, they were actively aiding and abetting the rise of ISIS. Both Hillary Clinton and Obama, Trump called them co-founders of ISIS. And I thought that was a very appropriate term. The media laughed, and then he put out the smoking gun documents showing it was true. So I think this is a very exciting time, Kenneth. I'm hoping that more revelations will be forthcoming and hopefully some prosecutions.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting thing. So in this whole thing here, would you speculate that if Trump ran today, he would win? And I guess it's unfair because, that's an unfair situation because the Democrats would have probably have had time to ramp up their campaign, pick somebody and actually put somebody against him. But there's a lot of momentum, and you attributed it to, the fact that we might have some progress, forward progress, expose some problems with the deep state here. But what about progress for Trump? Do you see this as a win for him? And is it something that would likely give him the win here in 2020?
I think it's a huge win for Trump, and I think it's a huge win for his agenda and for everything he's been saying. He's been calling this a witch hunt. He's been talking about traitors trying to undermine him. He's been exposing the ideology of these people. So this is a huge win for him. And I think if the presidential election were to be held today, he would crush it. I mean, absolutely dominate it. And that's partly because the Democrats have nobody, right? I mean, it's a bunch of bitter, angry social justice warriors. I mean, with really no message except hate and division and tear down America. I mean, they really sound ludicrous when you talk to everyday mainstream Americans who don't buy into this. You leave the college campus and these people all look like complete maniacs. And they live in this kind of bubble. So I think right now, Trump is in a very good situation, but I do think he has a giant vulnerability. And I think, the establishment or the deep state, if you want to borrow Trump's term to refer to these people, has a Trump card, not to be funny. And that is the economy, right? I mean, he has positioned himself as the savior of the economy, as the guy who really is causing the economy to grow, is causing all these great things to happen. But I think he's very vulnerable on that front because, first of all, the president doesn't control the economy. And nor would we want to live in a society where the president did control the economy. If we did, I mean, we would have been doomed under the regime of Barack Hussein Obama. Who does control the economy is the central bank, right? The Federal Reserve System, and the entities and forces connected with the Federal Reserve System, the Bank for International Settlements, the mega banks of the world, Goldman Sachs, Citi, Bank of America, et cetera. And if these people get together and decide that, hey, let's undermine the U.S. dollar, or let's pull the plug on the stock market, or let's start seriously draining the quantity of money. Let's seriously start sucking back some of this excess liquidity that we created during Q1, Q2, Q3, and on. We could be set for a massive recession, potentially worse, and it would be very hard to run in 2020 in the face of serious economic problems. And I think that's the really big risk that Trump is exposed to, and I think the other side is going to exploit that to their full ability if they can halt this progress that we've seen, and I think they're going to try.
Yeah, and fair criticism, the deficits, the debt we're going into, all of the things that we're seeing Trump do are things that he actually criticized, previous administrations for. And, I definitely see that, even though there's a lot of fundamental good, I do see Trump doing, kind of take the good with the bad sometimes, but fair criticism. I'm not very happy about the deficits and what we're seeing the government side, and him being excited about low interest rates that boost the stock market, all these things that manipulate the system to keep it trudging along here. So fair criticism and points well taken, Alex. So having said that, the Fox News did a town hall with Bernie Sanders. And it starts off just with such hypocrisy, if you ask me. They ask him about the taxes that he is going to be paying, or he paid with the book. I mean, all this news about him becoming a millionaire, having a best-selling book. And he deflects. He says, hey, people are asking, are you going to step up and be the leader, lead by example? Are you going to pay your fair share? What you are saying is your fair share off of what you made. And he totally deflects. He starts talking about, the crony capitalism of Amazon and Wall Street and all these things that, we agree with, but he says nothing about leading by example. He takes the Trump tax cuts and says, it's not about me. It's about these other people. And I was just blown away by the disingenuous nature of this guy who is just causing an uprising. and the hypocrisy of it. Oh, it's not my job, it's other people's job. So, where are we as a country and this ideology of socialism? Where's this country headed?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest points of concern for me is that over the long term, the trends do not look good, Kenneth. I mean, if you look at the polls now, most millennials would rather live in a socialist country than in a free market economy. They have no clue about the horrors that socialism has unleashed on the planet. You have people like Bernie Sanders, this weird guy who's never had a real job in his life, who goes to, party in the Soviet Union for his honeymoon. I mean, this is a mass murdering dictatorship. Why would you do that? The guy who defends the Sandinistas. I mean, this is serious. And, it's not a fringe phenomenon anymore. This is now solidly in the mainstream. And if you look, the younger people are even more in favor of this stuff. They're complete economic illiterates. They have no idea, even the most fundamental things, where prices come from, how capital accumulates. They don't understand anything about anything. They just feel entitled to confiscate other people's wealth. So I think on the one hand, the hypocrisy is stunning, and it really is a big vulnerability for them. I saw, just before coming on here, you had Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Michael Moore talking about income inequality. I mean, I think between the three of them, they own something like 14 houses. And, these are all very, very wealthy people. None of them have actually done real productive jobs, unless you want to call Michael Moore's crummy propaganda, producing something of value. And yet here they are lecturing the rest of us about how we need to surrender our wealth and give it to the masses. It's really crazy. And unfortunately, this is not going away. If anything, it's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. And if we were, to go back to what we were just talking about earlier, if we were to have a serious economic problem, say caused by massive government spending, Trump has literally signed now several bills that set new records for government spending. If we were to go into some kind of economic crisis, the stock market comes crashing down, the dollar loses value, we can't import cheap junk from China, all these young, ignorant Americans will hear the siren song from people like Bernie Sanders. Oh, it was the rich who did it. It was the free market that did it. Now we're going to come save you with government. We would be in a very, very unique and dangerous position and a dangerous time in American history, because previously Americans had at least a general understanding of how dangerous socialism was, how kooky some of these ideas were. But today, we're now several generations deep into the dumbing down, into the indoctrination in the government school system, to the point where most Americans don't understand these things anymore. And they could very easily be duped into surrendering more of their freedom to government in exchange for obviously phony promises of prosperity and wealth equality and all these kinds of things. And I think that is a huge danger, Kenneth. The trends look very, very bad. Once these millennials, 20, 30, and I'm a millennial, I hate to admit it, but once these people are solidified in their ways, it's very hard for them to admit their error. And if you look, the older Americans are dying off, the younger Americans are taking over, and we are in a very vulnerable position as a country.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, millennials' experiences were graduating into the '08 crisis in many situations, trouble finding jobs, trouble with affording cars and houses, and having to delay their life, their careers, and all of these things, moving out of their houses, dealing with this. And so they look and say, well, there's a problem with the system, as opposed to maybe the baby boomers who had a good experience with what they saw as capitalism, going out, working hard, getting a job, and, dealing and experiencing, what may have felt like a prosperous economy and enjoying a good quality of life. And these are very formidable years for millennials, or, the last 10 years have been very formidable years. And I can only imagine how much damage that has been done to the thinking and the controlling of the narrative that is going to take place now over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, which might have very, very lasting effects, in the near term than that, I would argue. So, any more thoughts on that, as it pertains to, where we are, millennials, the turning of the presidency? I mean, 10 years into this bull market now, it really is pretty difficult to think that the stock market is just going to keep going. Interest rates can stay artificially low forever, and that we aren't going to see a massive bubble burst in short order here.
Yeah, and I think that may well be what's coming. Now, I think one potential silver lining is that Trump seems to have a decent understanding of how the Federal Reserve manipulates the economy, how these central planners try to artificially determine what interest rates ought to be high or low, and the malinvestment this causes. And we know he knows this because he's spoken out about it. Actually, during the campaign trail, he talked about how the Federal Reserve had artificially propped up the economy under Obama to try to make him look good, how they juiced the stock market by manipulating interest rates. So Trump understands this stuff. And actually, he's spoken publicly about how a gold standard would probably be superior to the crazy system we have now. So he does have, some leverage here in that if the Federal Reserve decided to pull the plug on this, try to crash the economy, he could use that as an opportunity to expose these people. But the reality is, the economy is completely deformed right now in a very real sense. We have malinvestment all over the place. We've had these low interest rates for way too long, this QE1 and QE2. So what they did essentially during the 2008, 2009 crisis was kick the can down the road a little bit, but you can't do that forever. At some point, those chickens are going to come home to roost. And if it happens on Trump's watch, in light of this socialist indoctrination that's been taking place, the fake media, the lies that have been sold to the American people, it could become catastrophic very quickly. We could end up electing somebody like a Bernie Sanders, somebody like AOC to the presidency or the vice presidency, and end up in a situation where our freedoms would all be at risk. So this has happened to so many countries. I think there's this kind of misconception among everyday Americans that we're somehow immune to the stuff that happens all over the rest of the world. Venezuela wasn't always a socialist hellhole. Cuba wasn't always a socialist hellhole. Nazi Germany wasn't always Nazi, right? They elected these maniacs into power as a result of crises, as a result of bad circumstances and indoctrination. And then they ended up paying a very steep price for it. And so I think Americans need to understand, first of all, we're not immune to that. And second of all, we need to get to the root of the problem. And I think the root of the problem is miseducation. And so that's kind of one of the areas that I've been focusing on a lot now. I'll be focusing on it the rest of the year too, is the education system. Because the education system is cranking out little socialists by the millions, right? Every year. They can't even read their high school diploma, but they can tell you all about the gender ideology and the global warming and how socialism and spreading the wealth is so great. So this is a very, very big risk. And I think Trump is a smart guy. I think he would try to capitalize on this and expose some of this evil and some of this insanity. But the reality is we're in a very risky time. And unless we deal with the root cause of this, which is, millions of our kids being brainwashed every year in these government schools that are training them to be little socialists who reject free markets, who reject individual liberty, who reject limited government, the problem's only going to get worse. And that's really what it boils down to. And right now, very few are addressing the root cause of this problem. We talk about this, even Fox News talks about some of the problems of socialism, but as long as you let the government train up the children to become little socialists, we're not going to solve this.
Alex, you alluded to it here. We got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about the Green New Deal and the craziness of socialism, but I actually want to focus on the climate situation. I'll start you here and I'll kind of let you go. Is the climate changing? Why is it changing? And are humans to blame to the degree that we're hearing from the mainstream media and the liberal narrative?
Well, the climate may be changing. The climate has been changing since the Earth was created, right? The climate changes. If there's one thing you can be sure of, it's that the climate will change, right? We can look back in geological history and see that the climate has been at times very, very different than today. It gets warmer. The Vikings used to farm on Greenland. Go try to farm on Greenland today. You can't do it because it's so cold. It's frozen. You can't farm there. And so the Vikings all died and moved away. That's why they don't live on Greenland anymore. But are humans causing climate change? And more particularly, are humans causing climate change through emissions of carbon dioxide, which is literally the gas we exhale, right? They used to teach that in school when I was a kid. They don't anymore. Now they tell you that CO2 is this evil pollution and that the UN needs to regulate it and tax it. So, speaking of threats to freedom, this is a huge one, right? This man-made global warming hypothesis literally underpins this push for a global environmental regime that they've been advocating for decades now, pretty openly, in fact. The reality is this hypothesis is completely discredited. It makes absolutely no sense. And Trump knows this, right? His top climate advisor, Dr. William Happer, who I know, he and I spoke at a climate conference couple of years ago. And he has been doing some very good work. And people can go watch the interviews I did with him on YouTube. He explains that no, CO2 is not driving dangerous climate change. CO2 is actually very good for the planet. In fact, the Earth is starving for more CO2 right now. He said plants were designed to live in an environment with 4 to 5 times as much concentration of CO2 in the air. And so the plants right now are literally starving for CO2. That's why so many farmers pump it into their greenhouses to stimulate plant growth. The idea that this would cause some sort of dangerous warming is ludicrous. But if you're a totalitarian, it is the perfect pretext for virtually every kind of tyranny you can imagine, right? If you call the gas that people exhale pollution, you can tax and you can regulate every human activity and even non-activities, right? Sleeping, sitting on the couch, you produce CO2 because you're exhaling. So it's a very dangerous hypothesis. It's also completely ludicrous, which is why these people are not willing to debate it. They're not willing to discuss it. They just say, no, the science is settled. We're not going to talk about it. You're a climate denier. We're going to put you in jail. It's really quite pathetic. And the thing is, Trump knows this. So he's trying to set up the Presidential Commission on Climate Security, which would be led by Dr. William Happer, who's serving on the National Security Council right now. And it would re-examine this so-called science and pseudoscience that underpins this hysteria. And the other side now is freaking out about this, Kenneth. You have the media saying this would be a threat to national security and that it was going to waste money and all these crazy things. The reality is it would be hugely liberating, right? I mean, it would set humanity free from this hoax that the gas we exhale is pollution and is going to kill us. And so they can't have it. So right now there is a very rabid, a very vicious battle going on behind the scenes that most Americans have no idea is even happening, where you even have some Republicans, I call them rhinos, Republicans in name only, trying to pressure the president not to create this commission, because this commission would blow up the whole pretext for all of this, right? For carbon taxes, for all these UN agencies, for all this environmental garbage propaganda being pushed in our schools, for all this regulation, all these federal programs. And if you get rid of that, you set the deep state back decades, maybe longer. And so this is a very interesting battle that's raging right now. We've written about it in the New American. Most people have no idea it's happening. But the future of freedom may well depend on it, because if they can convince humanity that the gas they exhale is pollution, the sky is the limit in terms of imposing bad policy on us, and we need to stop it.
So I'm not a scientist. Most people aren't scientists, but the threat of something catastrophic and game changing is something that gets people's attention. And, this whole idea of we have 12 years to curb climate change and, our carbon emissions before it's basically this runaway effect that's going to kill everybody. I mean, that's a pretty serious claim. I mean, do you have any insight as to what they're talking about, what they're pointing to? And is there any validity to what they're saying?
Yeah, and the hypothesis is that emissions of CO2, in particular human emissions of CO2, which, just for some perspective, it makes up a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I mean, the human emissions of CO2 are basically so insignificant you can hardly measure them. Nobody even knows how much is coming from humans and how much is from natural sources. Every time a leaf falls on the ground, it decomposes and releases CO2. But the hypothesis is that this tiny little addition of CO2 that humans are responsible for, from our cars, from our transportation, our shipping, our breathing, things like that, is going to drive climate change by trapping heat within the atmosphere. Now, I've written about some studies that completely demolish the greenhouse theory, right? The idea that these gases are actually trapping heat. Nobody has successfully responded to these studies. I'm not a scientist, as you say, so I don't know whether the studies are correct or not, but I think it's interesting. Nobody has even put out a paper challenging these. This is peer-reviewed science in the scientific literature that has not been challenged. But even more importantly, I mean, you can show that the hypothesis is wrong simply by using a couple of graphs, right? The UN had 70-something computer models that were supposed to forecast temperatures based on CO2 emission increase. Every single one of these predicted increased and accelerated warming. And the reality is, as we measure it through weather balloons, as we measure it through satellite data, there has been no increase in warming over something like 2 decades now. This completely demolishes every UN climate model. It exposes the fraud, right? Because if the UN was just honestly trying to come up with an accurate assessment, you would expect, just based on the laws of probability, half might be over, half would be under. In reality, you got every single one was way over. So I think this suggests deliberate fraud. I mean, you could literally hire a monkey and give him some dice and have him roll the dice, and the monkey would be more accurate in terms of predicting the climate than the UN. And they point to this UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN IPCC, and they said, this is the Bible of climate science, and so you have to believe it. Well, I tracked down some of the people who served on this committee. I've interviewed them. People can go watch the interviews on YouTube. People can read about them in the New American Magazine. And I have spoken with many who have said that this is all a fraud. Just recently, I was in Sweden, and I interviewed Dr. Nils Axel Morner, who is the lead sea level reviewer for the UN IPCC. And he was looking at this stuff, and he said, hey, I've been studying sea levels for 50 years. This is simply not true. Sea levels are not rising. This is not accurate. He told them to fix it. They refused, and so he resigned. And this is the same story I'm hearing over and over again from scientists who served on this in their area of expertise. They say, hey, this is not what we said. This is not an accurate reflection of reality or the data. There's a big problem here. And of course, the UN is not interested in that. So this is really political science. If you talk to the experts, and I've talked to many, many of them. I mean, again, people can go on YouTube and see videos I've done with some of the most prestigious experts in these fields in the world. What you'll find is that we are being duped. We are being deceived on an enormous scale. The stakes are about as high as can be. They're telling us this is a global problem, and so we need a global government to solve this alleged global problem. And this global government will have all sorts of awesome powers, right? We need to get rid of private land ownership. We need to regulate every speck of everything that you can think of. And it is a very, very dangerous thing. It needs to be put to rest. And that's the reality.
So, Alex, I mean, that's pretty interesting analysis right there. Now, I guess some of the undeniable stuff, at least from someone who's not a scientist, is when you see some of these like images from space, like a 2008 versus 2018. Look at these ice caps that was once covered, and now it's a fraction of what it was years ago. Is there more to the story of that? Is it nuanced? Is it more than just meets the eye from a very elementary look at the one versus the other? What's going on with some of these?
Yeah, and I mean, it really varies in different regions of the world, right? There's some regions of the world where the sea is rising a little bit. There's some regions of the world where the sea is declining a little bit, where sea levels are declining a little bit. There's some areas where ice is growing on a massive level, right? Ice in Antarctica is expanding very, very rapidly. Ice in parts of Greenland is expanding very rapidly. Certain glaciers give the UN a climate tax. Well, if you actually look at what they're finding under these receding glaciers, they are finding, among other things, ancient forests that were buried in ice 1,000 years ago. And so now they're telling us, oh, it's going to be so hot, it's unprecedented in human history. That is absolute baloney. Those ice caps weren't there, those glaciers weren't there 1,000 years ago. That's why there was forests growing there. And yet they don't want to talk about any of these things, right? So we do have a lot of data that shows the man-made global warming hypothesis is incorrect. They're not willing to acknowledge that data yet. Trump is very aware of that data. A lot of the people advising Trump are very familiar with this information. The question now is, can it get out to the masses? And I think in the United States, there has been a lot of success in educating people about this reality. I think most people, and even the establishment polls have shown this, right? The Pew survey did a survey a couple years ago, and they found out that most Americans reject the man-made global warming hypothesis. Now, you'd never know that from watching the CNNs and the Fox Newses of the world, but most Americans, when they said, first of all, do you believe the earth is warming? Second of all, if you do believe it's warming, do you believe man is causing it? Most Americans rejected the man-made global warming hypothesis, and yet this was nowhere to be found in the media. Now, in other parts of the world, it's not quite that good news. In Scandinavia, for example, almost everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid. I just came back from Scandinavia, and I interviewed the scientists. They know it's a bunch of baloney, but the regular population that watches the government-funded news channels doesn't know that, and so that's very problematic. But, I think in the end, these people are going to be exposed. And actually, the scientist I just mentioned, Dr. Nils Axel Morner, who was working on the UN IPCC as a sea level reviewer, he said this is inevitably going to be exposed. We're now heading into a period of global cooling. The Earth is going to get much, much colder for a period of decades here. And these people are going to be exposed. They are all going to be known as liars and frauds. And he's worried this is going to bring down the whole field of science with it. And so he's trying to sound the alarm now. So, I think interesting things are happening in this. Trump knows this. That's why he announced we're pulling out of the Paris Agreement. He knows it's all a giant fraud. He called it a hoax on the campaign. So good things are happening on this front, but you have billions and trillions of dollars at stake here. You have careers and reputations, and what are people going to think about CNN once they realize this whole thing was a fraud? Well, the last remaining true believers in the Communist News Network are going to realize they've been duped. And so, there's going to be a lot of resistance to the truth that's coming out here, but it is coming out.
Alex, it's incredible how much fake news is being put out. And I think people are more and more open to the idea that we are being lied to on another level here. And maybe it's because of the internet. More of us are just able to communicate with each other to an exponentially larger degree now. Social media, the goods and bads of that. But the internet is really leveling the playing field, and I think exposing things. And then I mean, the Trump 2016 election, the Russia thing. I mean, it's starting to be understood that we can't trust the mainstream narrative. And I really hope that there's a turning point that we start to see here. And thank you to guys like yourself who are out there exposing this and really fighting the good fight here. So with that, if you would, please share some closing thoughts here. If people want to learn more about your site and whatnot and what you offer, let them know where they can go, what they can find. But before you do, please just share some closing thoughts as we close out this interview.
Yeah, well, I think you made a really important point there, Kenneth. I think you hit a home run. The reality is the mainstream media no longer controls the narrative. And I think the 2016 presidential election was proof positive of that. 2 out of the top 100 newspapers in America endorsed Trump. 2. Right, and he won the presidency. You had all their fake polls showing that Trump was going to be buried, right? New York Times, something like 80% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. The Huffington Compost, 98% sure Hillary was going to win. And they all got exposed as liars and fools, right? And they were, they had even rigged the election. They had probably massive amounts of voter fraud, and they still lost. And the only reason is because Americans now recognize that the media is lying to us and has been lying to us. And, this is now out of the box, right? They're not going to be able to put this genie back into the bottle. Americans know they've been lied to. And this is not just unique to America. People all over the world now are realizing they've been lied to. They're having their country stolen from them, their freedom stolen from them. So there are very, very good things happening in terms of public awakening. And it's because of, shows like yours and people doing the types of things that we're doing right now, just talking about this and bypassing the so-called, when I was in journalism school at the University of Florida, they told us so many times, you're the gatekeepers, right? You get to decide what people are going to hear. And they were living in the past, right? That is no longer the situation anymore. Journalists and the mainstream media are not gatekeepers anymore. They're laughing stocks. People know they're lying and nobody wants to hear it anymore. Now in the world of the internet, we can go find out the truth on our own. And that's an incredibly positive thing. So thank you for having me on, Kenneth. If people want to find out more about what I've been up to, most of my writing goes up at thenewamerican.com or in the print magazine. You can subscribe at thenewamerican.com. It's called The New American Magazine. It's been around for over 30 years now. It was the product of a merger of 2 earlier publications. And, some of the best, in my opinion, journalism in the country. That's why I write for The New American, is because I think it is the best source for accurate information that you need to stay free. I'm also on social media. Twitter is at @AlexNewman_JOU. Facebook is AlexJNewman86. I have my own personal site. It's libertysentinel.org. I keep an education blog at freedomproject.org or freedomproject.com. It's called the Newman Report, where I blog weekly on education, because again, I think education is going to be the key battlefront here, right? The establishment recognizes that. We need to recognize that too. And so thanks again for having me, Kenneth. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate what you're doing, and keep up the awesome work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time here on the show, Alex.
Thank you, Kenneth.